In the year 1973, Israel fought an indecisive war against Egypt and Syria. This war, the Yom Kippur War, was the turning point for Baathism and Islamism. But what if Israel were to lose this war decisively? That is the question of this alternate history timeline. The first thing we're going to have to change is that the USSR will have to give Egypt and Syria nukes since Israel had nukes, and if Israel was on the verge of losing the war, they would just nuke Damascus or Egypt. This would deter Israel from using its own nukes. Then Egypt and Syria would inflict several defeats on Israel, forcing them to sue for peace. The peace agreements would be as such. Syria and Egypt completely reclaimed the Golan Heights and Sinai Peninsula, which were areas that Israel seized from them decisively in 1967 in an embarrassing defeat for Egypt and Syria. Jews living anywhere that Palestinians used to live in or owned land, who would be alive at the time, are expelled, with the exception of the ones that the Israelis bought fairly from the Palestinians. And if they bought it from another Israeli or inherited it from a parent or something, they get a compensation. And all this expelling would create land dominated by Palestinians, and the areas dominated by the Palestinians that border the Golan Heights or Sinai get annexed by Egypt or Syria. Any Arabs that end up living in Israel are given equal rights to Israelis, and any Israelis that end up living in Egypt and Syria are also given equal rights. They would not want to recreate the Palestinian state. Palestinian nationalism was not only a reaction to Zionism, but also the failure of Pan-Arab nationalism. And Israelis could just go, "You already have your Palestinian state, leave us alone." And finally, I don't think Egypt and Syria would plan to weaken Israel as much as possible, since they'd want to keep it around a bit longer to use Israel as a boogeyman to keep pushing for Arab nationalism. This, combined with the fact that Jews are a very capitalistic people, so the United States would need to keep the Jewish state around for the rest of the Cold War, we can expect Israel to survive at least until the end of the Cold War. The areas that the Arabs would annex would become like Northern Ireland. Radical groups on both sides would be wreaking havoc in the region. I wouldn't be surprised if several Palestinians moved to Jordan in response, creating a new problem in terms of demographics, as Israelis likely move in if they can for the same reasons: good school, good community, religious and national obligation. It also means Gaza wouldn't expel all of the Israeli settlers like it has done in our timeline, since some would be qualified to stay. Before the war, the Baathists were losing popularity due to the humiliating defeat I mentioned, and Islamism was expanding into the power vacuum. The Yom Kippur War was an attempt to repopularize Baathism. Losing the war was the nail in the coffin for Baathism. In our timeline, especially since many people from the poorer Arab countries like Egypt and Syria were working in Saudi Arabia temporarily because of the large salaries, then returning home radicalized. After seeing the success of the Baathists in the Yom Kippur War, an Iranian version of the Baathists might overthrow the Shah instead of the Islamist Shias that did in our timeline. Since secularism and socialism are some of the core beliefs of Baathism, the new Republic of Iran would form ties with the Soviet Union, but I think Angola is analogous to go with, being an oil-rich country with socialist and communist ideologies itself. While secularism is likely one of the core goals of the revolution, Shia Islam is a large part of the Iranian identity, and even more so since this revolution would be Pan-Iranist. So I doubt it's repressed. It would probably be like pre-Erdogan Turkey in terms of what it would look like. Islamism likely becomes an opposition force as time goes on, paired with anti-socialist and secularist opposition. A multi-party system based off the three ideologies likely develops eventually. I see the Baathists and Iranians having a sort of containment strategy against the Wahhabi states like Saudi Arabia, like what NATO had against the USSR, and with the Baathists and Iranians being backed by the Soviets. Since Iran would be pan-Iranist, they would want to annex Kurdistan, since Kurds are an Iranic ethnic group, and they'd be persecuting the Arabs in Khuzestan horribly. This would provoke Saddam Hussein to start the Iran-Iraq war earlier. Since he already hated that land dominated by Arabs was having its natural resources extracted by an inferior race, that being the Persians. You might be wondering at this point, why doesn't Iran just exchange Khuzestan for Iraqi Kurdistan? But Khuzestan contains a large proportion of Iran's oil. In addition to being Shia, Iran wouldn't want to give it up. And I don't know if Iraqi Kurdistan is rich in natural resources, but if it is, then Iraq won't want to give it up. You might think it's a straight trade, but no one's going to say, hey, I'll trade you this natural resource-rich area you want in exchange for this natural resource-rich area I want. It's more likely this area should be mine due to these historical claims and the people that live there. Give to me, please, so that I can have a natural resource-rich area in addition to my other natural resource-rich area. Hypocritical, but Spain's claim to the British territory of Gibraltar, despite having two towns in Morocco that Morocco claims are its own. Virtually no difference, but somehow Gibraltar is a British colony forcefully taken from Spain, according to the Spanish, and the Moroccan Spanish towns are not. Iraq would have its butt handed to it, since the only reason why the war ended in a stalemate in our timeline is because of both the United States and the USSR taking Iraq's side. Israel would probably align with Iran, since Iran wouldn't be Islamist and feel much religious solidarity with Palestine. And since they're not Arabs, their nationalism wouldn't either, while Saudi Arabia's Islamism and the Baathists' nationalism would get in the way of a relationship with Israel. Maybe after losing the Yom Kippur War, hardline Israeli Zionists take power, and after the USSR falls, the United States wouldn't see much of a point keeping Israel as an ally. The only thing that would keep their alliance going would be the momentum from the Cold War, as sustained existence of a secular mass Rome might mean a secular Arab world versus Jewish extremism. Another thing keeping Israel's relationship with the US going would be the evangelical Christians who still believe in the Old Testament promise of God promising the Jews the land of Israel. However, with the sustained existence I mentioned, evangelicalism might lose popularity in favour of more traditional Protestant churches, Catholicism and Orthodoxy, or maybe within Protestantism, this eschatology about the modern state of Israel would lose popularity. Back to Iran and Iraq, things will go downhill for Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and this timeline's Iran will keep getting bigger. Saddam Hussein will most probably still start the Persian Gulf War by invading Kuwait to relieve itself of the debt Iraq would have accumulated from the Iran-Iraq war, since Kuwait will still have funded Iraq, and Saddam Hussein will be very unpopular after this happens, because he would have lost 2 wars back to back. America might not even need to fight in the Iraq war. The Iraqi people would probably be so sick of Saddam Hussein at this point that they would probably overthrow him. After he gets deposed, regardless of whether it's by the Americans or by the Iraqis, it will be the Assads that expand into the power vacuum and not the Iranians. So either way, we wouldn't see Islamism take much of a hold in Iraq, creating ISIS as we know it today, since the Iraqis would hate the Iranians so much after defeating them in the Iran-Iraq war, and Iraq would already be more secular in this timeline due to the influence of Islamism being curbed by the victory at Yom Kippur. And Iran would expand into Pakistan and Afghanistan by helping India in one of the Indo-Pakistani wars and being a big deciding factor and conquering and annexing the areas of Pakistan dominated by Iranic peoples and annexing the areas dominated by Iranic-speaking peoples in Afghanistan by helping the Soviets in their invasion of Afghanistan. This would mean that China would lose access to the Indian Ocean, which it currently gets through Pakistan. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh would be brought under Indian submission while India can focus entirely on its land disputes with China. Bhutan and Nepal would be taking Chinese money but politically aligned to India as it fortifies its border with China. India would have a less developed nuclear program compared to that of our timeline as well, but as two titans start colliding, that changes fast. China would also speed up the Sinicization of Tibet, militarizing the region and pushing forward plans to dam the Brahmaputra and Ganges rivers, whose sources are in Tibet. This means Al-Qaeda wouldn't exist, since there would be no friendly Pakistan for America to send people to radicalize the Afghans through. But don't think this means that Islamic terrorism would never become mainstream. After all, thanks to Egypt's success in the Yom Kippur War and ending up annexing much of Israel, it would now share a border with Jordan. And Jordan already shares a border with Syria, so this would repopularize Baathism in Jordan. The Baathists in Egypt and Syria, or now, since Syria would have taken over much of Iraq, it would be now known as the Arab Republic of Mesopotamia. So these two countries would fund Baathist movements in Jordan to try and get Jordan to unify with the Arab Republic of Mesopotamia and Egypt to form a super Arab state, which has always been one of the core goals of the Baathist movement. But the Jordanian dynasty claims direct descent from Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, which would definitely put up a fight, and the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia would support them and would fund radicals in the process. These radicals might take the place of Al-Qaeda in making Islamic terrorism mainstream. The United States would still try to radicalize Muslims living in the newly conquered Pakistan. However, it would not be as successful since they would not be being ruled by people who are trying to force another religion on them. All this means that there would be a massive war with Iran and Israel on one side, supported by India and the Arab Republic of Mesopotamia, and Egypt supported by China on the other side. And whether Jordan or Saudi Arabia get involved and which side they'd be on if they do is up in the air, and whether Russia or the United States would support anyone is also up in the air. If you like this video and want me to continue making videos, I can do this for a living if I make it to at least 1,000 subscribers. So share this video around and subscribe yourself if you enjoyed this.